Which now brings us to the fourth thing that we wanted to share with you as we prepare for a serious, deep, and meaningful, impactful study of the New Testament that we think will make a huge difference, is a better understanding of the gospel writers and their audience. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There are a million ways that you can look at them and you can understand them. The beautiful thing for me is to recognize their unique contributions and the fact that they are all going to give you a distinctly powerful testimony that Jesus is the Christ. And they seem to be writing to slightly different audiences as well. So we're not going to cover everything here. This is a very brief 30,000-foot overview. But you have these first three, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that we often call the synoptic gospels. Synoptic, if you look at the English word, comes from S-Y-N, which is the same, kind of the same root as synonym.
Or symphony.
Symphony. And optic is the view of. So it's the same view. These three are going to see largely the same kinds of things, tell you largely the same kinds of stories. John is not a synoptic. He's 93, 94% unique in his writing. Our friend and colleague, Hank Smith, who has shared this fun analogy that just makes sense when you're trying to understand the four gospel writers, he uses the analogy of a stage. That you go to the theater to watch a stage play, and you have the balcony here at the back, and then you have the two sections down on the floor, and then you have the stage. The Gospel of Mark is a beautiful description of what somebody would notice about the life of Christ from the balcony. Mark is probably the first gospel written based on the synoptics. Of these three, he's probably first because we can see a lot of comparisons with Matthew and Luke from the sayings of Mark. His story begins quite late. The very first thing out of the Gospel of Mark is the baptism of Christ. 30 years. It's almost as if the person in the balcony got there a little late and said, hey, are there any more tickets available? And they said, yeah, there's one. So he got there late, missed some of the opening scenes, and we don't get anything from the first 30 years of Jesus' life in Mark's Gospel. He picks it up at the baptism, and his Gospel ends very abruptly in the original texts, and we'll talk about that many months from now when we get to that story. And because he's up in the balcony, he might have a little harder time hearing than the others. And so what is he going to focus on? He's going to focus largely on what Jesus does. So if you want to read about the miracles that Jesus performs, Mark is a really good place to go because he gives you a very beautiful overview and he gives you more detail. He seems to see more of what's going on with the miracles of Christ than some of the other gospel writers who maybe are closer to the stage and focusing on other aspects. So that's Mark. Matthew is sitting down here, and he's writing largely to the Jewish men and the Jewish audience, trying to convince them that Jesus is the Christ. Consequently, what is he going to focus on? He's going to see elements from the Old Testament that Jesus is now fulfilling. So in Matthew's gospel, he is focusing a lot on the sayings. So if there's a speech in all of the gospels, Matthew, of the synoptics, Matthew's the one you're going to want to go to because he finds the greatest meaning in what Jesus is saying and how that fulfills Old Testament prophecy. As if to say, it's as if Matthew's sitting here at the front and he stands up and turns to his group in his audience saying, did you hear what did you hear what just happened on the stage? That fulfills the prophecy from Isaiah. And so he's constantly showing us how Jesus is the Son of God, or the son of Abraham, the son of David, and the new Moses. Because those are the people that the Jewish people, largely in his audience, would find the most compelling to believe that he was the Christ. Luke, he's sitting here, and he's a Gentile. He's a convert. He's not likely, it's possible, but it's not likely that he's a first-hand witness of all these events that he's writing about. He tells us that he's gathering his information from a whole bunch of other people, from first-hand sources, putting it together. But he's a Gentile convert who happens to be a physician. And he is going to give you a very balanced approach between the sayings and the doings of Christ. And he's also going to give you a very balanced view of Jesus being a very kind and tender healer. You're going to notice it's in Luke's gospel that if he teaches a story or shares a story about Jesus healing a man, look, because either right before or right after, you're very likely to find Jesus healing a woman. Luke will give you example after example of Jesus reaching out and blessing people who are often on the margins of their society, people who are very easy for maybe the Jewish people to overlook at first pass. Well, Luke is this Gentile doctor who's focused on suffering and relieving that suffering. He's going to focus on a lot of those stories, which leaves one place for John, our final gospel writer. And John seems to be right on the stage with Jesus. He's giving you a backstage pass. You get to see Jesus in settings that you don't get in the synoptics. Conversations one-on-one, miracles, parables, little instances with Jesus's confrontation with the leaders of the Jews, the Sanhedrin or the chief priests. So when we can understand that each of these four writers, they're not trying to compete with each other, and they don't seem to be writing their gospel in the same room around the same table saying, "Okay, let's all collaborate on this." They seem to be giving their unique perspective, their unique testimony that Jesus is the Christ. And the fact that maybe they'll tell stories from a slightly different angle or give you some different details in a different order than a different writer doesn't mean that we can then discount everything that they've all said and said, well, they're not agreeing with each other, any more than when you go to a fast and testimony meeting. You don't say, well, everybody's testimony has to be word for word exact, and their experiences with Jesus have to line up perfectly, because we're all coming at this from a different angle. And what an amazing blessing to have four unique and powerful, standalone, but powerful when you pull them all together as well, testimonies that Jesus is the Christ. Whether you're a Jew or a Gentile, whether you're a man or a woman, whether you're bond or free, it doesn't matter where you live, you can benefit from these different writers. Which brings us to a new concept, this idea of Christology.
Just a fancy term for the study or discussion of Christ. Whenever you see L-O-G-Y at the end of something, it comes from the Greek word logos, which means to study, or the knowledge about something. You get in lots of different fields. I want to mention that, could you imagine how much poorer we would be in our knowledge of God, of Jesus Christ, if any one of these books was missing? So what if we only had these three? Or just only John? There'd be so much we wouldn't get. So as you jump into the New Testament this year, instead of looking for discrepancies or where they seem to be saying things different from one another, also look for, what am I learning from their unique voice that can matter to me today? Beautiful.
So with this Christology, a study of who is the Christ, the person, his mission, what is he, who is he? You'll notice that there's high Christology and then there's low Christology, and it's a range. High Christology would be those things that would emphasize the Savior's divinity, his godliness. So if you look at the four Gospels, you'll see that John has by far the highest Christology. Jesus doesn't show very much weakness, if any at all, in the Gospel of John. Nobody ever carries his cross for him. He doesn't fall to the ground in Gethsemane in the Gospel of John. He doesn't need anyone to do anything for him in his Gospel. And you'll notice the lowest Christology, which emphasizes more of his humanity, more of his mortality, more of the things that you and I can really, quite frankly, relate to, is Mark. So he's going to be much more sandals on the ground, if you will, in the Gospel of Mark. Very relatable. And you'll notice in Mark also, keep in mind, he starts late. Jesus only is going to go to Jerusalem one time in the Gospel of Mark. That's at the very end of his life for the infinite atonement, the week of the atoning sacrifice. All of his stories and movement are among the poor common people up in Galilee, and Mark is just going to immerse you in that very relatable, those very relatable to us humans parts of Christ's life and mission.
Another way of looking at this is to say, when we look at Jesus from this perspective, he's the very relatable Jesus that we'd feel like, boy, I could imagine being around him. And this perspective on Jesus is the aspirational, I want to be more like him. And I aspire, that stretch goal of like, that's so far beyond anything I could have ever imagined, but now I can see it. I want that as well. I want to be like him. So this is a very helpful framework as we consider the four Gospels that we'll be spending multiple months on. And this is important that we do, because the four Gospels is the essence of revealing to us who Jesus is as a divine God enfleshed on earth.